So I'm taking export as one of the most common mode. And the biggest problem with exporting in the country is we focus on low added value. I can make a very simple example. If you look at the coffee price, we produce, I believe, the second highest volume of coffee in Vietnam. But if you compare the price of coffee in Vietnam and Brazil, it's 5 times smaller than Brazil. And compared to other Asian countries in the area, we are also far behind. Surprisingly, we have the very attractive market size according to the global competitiveness from the World Economic Forum last year. As you can see, the market size, we are quite attractive. We also have a very good health and primary education. But if you look at the innovation, infrastructure, and the labor market efficiency, there's something wrong. We are too far behind. Also the technological readiness. So that is one of the reasons I could explain why the manufacturing is still focusing on low added product value. So come all the way from different DEX research, I was thinking how to understand better the process of internationalization. If some of you have heard about the entrepreneurship theory, you probably have known that there are two theories that explain why firms internationalize. So one is the behavioral theory, which included Uppsala model, for example, or network approach, and another is from economics theories. And using the network approach, is also one of the most recent perspectives when we look at the internationalization process of small and medium enterprise. And I was thinking how firms can build such capabilities to be outperform others, to be stronger in the internationalization process. And of course, if you look at the networking approach, we consider as the external resources. I have 3 big questions here. First thing, how can you build such capabilities? And second is, how can you use different external resources to build up the capabilities? And the third question is, if you have such capabilities, how can you contribute to the export performance? And interestingly, I look at the internationalization process in different phases. So for normal firms, of course, it's starting with the no export activities, and then they either export indirectly or directly. Recently, if you look at the global market, some firms jump from here to export directly, and those firms we call one global. For example, Uber is one example. And for part of my research, also a part of my PhD, I collected 59 different items to measure the capabilities and the external resources that influence to the internationalization process. And those include the operational capabilities, and I collected 28 items. The dynamic capabilities, I have 11 items. And for the networking resources, I collected 12 items. And for the export performance, I collected 8 items. The difference between resources and capabilities is what the firm can do, and resources is what the firm has. So that's only different like that. So my area of study is I focus on Ho Chi Minh City, where they have around 1/3 of the manufacturing firms and retail activities in the country. And approximately there are about 10,000 small and medium enterprises. There are no official numbers, and that's really difficult to do research in Vietnam for normal scientists. And the target population is I look at the 10 top exporting sector in Vietnam. My research up to now I divided into 2 phases. Of course, at the moment I'm not here yet. Yeah, I have no outcome to show yet, but I have done, and somewhere here to finalize the construct and indicators. So for the first phase, I did 10 interview with 10 CEO of the companies to understand how they are doing business in Vietnam, what the problems they are facing with, and is there any plan to deal with such extensive cooperation in the area and also in the global market. How firms are ready? Do they really observe? Do they really have the capability to learn and to internationalize? And I believe within the next couple of weeks I will be here, and then I have to conduct my second survey with in a larger scale, around 100 companies. So, very briefly about my research. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Does anyone have questions or comments for our speaker?
Actually, I missed the first part.
Yeah.
I haven't seen much about the indicators that you want to measure.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if we have talked about that. If you have talked about that.
No, it's just I just introduced briefly. Yeah, it's a combination of different literature review, yeah, and theory.
So are you coming up with the new indicators yourself?
Of course, yeah. You can see from the phase number 1 now I'm modifying those indicators, and as I said, I collected 59 items in total.
Okay.
But I believe after the pilot study with 10 in-depth interview, I believe I roughly cut down to 40 something.
Okay. So how can you be sure that how can you validate your indicators that it can actually capture what you need and it could be standardized measure?
Yes, that's the first question when I proposed this work, and that's why I divided the study into phases. Of course, I have to talk with the companies to really understand what's happening in the context.
Okay.
Yes, and the indicator, as I mentioned, is from theory, and it could not be applied to the area. It's a different case.
Okay.
And now I'm using Atlas.ti to analyze the indicators one more time, and that's the reason why it's more convincing to continue the research.
Okay. If there's no question, I will ask more. But if there's
yeah, is anybody else have a question? I guess I'm not talking so much about political science. Yeah.
I have one, and then perhaps we'll come back to you.
Yes, sure.
Yeah.
Is your ultimate aim to produce policy outcomes in terms of telling the government what it should do to support SMEs?
To be honest, the work first is to qualify part of my PhD, and I believe, yeah, the outcome is really important. I think not only for the policy makers, but also for the people who do business, who concerns about export in area.
So will you feed your results back to the businesses that you surveyed?
In this survey, I'm not doing alone yet. I have different partners. For example, the VCCI, the Vietnamese Chamber of Commerce, and so part of it. I also work with the universities, where I'm more eager to cooperate, give them data, and of course, by the end, I should give the result to them. Yeah.
Thank you.
And just one more thing, because in the institution, we're not doing research. We also giving the consultation service. So at the end, each PhD student should be able to give something to train the companies. We have a different network around more than 10 countries to train different companies.
And are you interested in the legal framework that supports SME activities as well?
Up to now, I'm not very deep in that, but of course, yeah, it's also one of my concerns.
Actually, I really like your phases of research, but one thing I'm very worried about is you have indicator in the phase 1, you have the surveys in the phase 2. Right?
I have survey also in the phase 1.
Okay. Do you have some kind of feedback process? If you get something new from your survey, I have two questions actually. That's the first question. Do you have feedback process between those two? I mean, it could be another chapter. I mean, you can do this all the way through, and you have this interaction to improve this phase of research, and it becomes another chapter in your thesis. I don't know, but that's what I feel.
Yeah.
Second thing, when it comes to indicator, because I was using some indicator as well.
Yeah.
Some of there are two kinds of information I see: objective and subjective information. I always have doubt in subjective information, but realistically, some indicators it could not be objective.
Yeah.
For example, the corruption perception index or
Yeah.
things like that. I think even global competitiveness, some areas objective, some areas is subjective. So I'm not sure how to deal with it, but need to be very careful when you have so many subjective elements in your indicators. It becomes really difficult to gain credibility and make people believe in your results. It's very difficult. I don't say very difficult. It's not easy. It's not easy to gain validity, and if you want to say firmly about your outcome policy recommendation, is probably a very important thing to think about.
Just a feedback.
Yes?
So please.
Let me just say that my background is in history, so really this is a new thing for me.
Yeah.
But
No problem.
the way I see it, in the Philippines, the process of internationalization of SMEs largely depend on the stability and performance of the regime itself. It fluctuates, depending on who's in power. Will you also look into that? Because since I'm a historian, I'm concerned with time frame. So from this contemporary, from what year to what year, and will regimes in that sort of time frame be considered in the way you analyze your data? That's a valid question.
Really good point.
Okay, there you go.
That's a question.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
will you consider?
Because I believe if you look at business in that point of view, it's either bottom up or top down. And I believe that there's a difference between economics and business, because I'm part of business and we usually look at the bottom up. So we go from low to higher. And from economics, you look from top down, with more relevant to policy makers. And that's why people call economics is dead, because business of small and medium enterprise, it changes something. It's linking the world by different mechanisms. So if myself, I'm looking at that part too.
I have very little objection. You cannot say that business and economics are different things.
Yeah, no,
That's okay.
yeah. So, any other questions?
Looks like I think we're done. So thank you very much to Tuan for your presentation. Our next speaker is Jason Lim from the University of Wollongong in Australia. Just for those people who've come in, we have rearranged the program slightly just to accommodate the
Well, it says in the book
speakers.
that it started at 11:30. So I'm
Actually,
confused.
it was a mistake in the
Yeah,
book, so
I
we
thought so.
started at 11.
Okay, this is getting me nervous. Alright, okay, so from Vietnam in the 21st century, we now travel back in time 60 years. I'm not sure why I'm in this panel, like I mentioned with Petra. My topic is actually about trading and business ties between Singapore and South Vietnam during the Cold War. So there will be, it's really a time when both Singapore and South Vietnam were, in a way, trying to find new pathways for themselves, as they head towards independence, or in the case of Vietnam, as they had to face a rather devastating war. So, just as I will say at the very outset that this is what you're going to hear next in the next 15 minutes is really just the result of a very, very preliminary research that I did. My main research focus is actually on Chinese business and trade networks from the 19th and the 20th centuries, networks that stretch across China or East Asia to Southeast Asia. And my interests also extend as to what happened to these networks during the Cold War. So once I had several projects out of the way, I could look at a project like this where I was thinking of just looking beyond Chinese trade networks to look at government-to-government relations as well, and what trade meant to Singapore and South Vietnam during this period. I thought that maybe I could use this seminar as an occasion to just raise some thoughts based on the preliminary research that I did. The aim of today's presentation is actually to look at or to understand the intentions of government and traders from Singapore. So it's actually more from Singapore's perspective, and the challenges faced in the Singapore-South Vietnam trade. Now the last point I have down there actually gives a very broad overview of the political development of the two countries. So Singapore limited self-government 1955, autonomy 1959, and independence 1965. While South Vietnam went through a more rocky road. The Republic of Vietnam was proclaimed in 1955, followed by the Vietnam War, and then the fall of Saigon in 1975. Now, some of the questions I've asked, and it's listed in the hand programming book as well. But in the program book, I raised, I think, 5 or 6 questions, which is impossible to answer, I realized, in a 15-minute presentation. So I was just too ambitious. So I'll just narrow down to these 3 questions. So one is, of course, if you think of how South Vietnam and Singapore, they were new countries, and yet in the case of South Vietnam, it was going through a military conflict. So if you are a government agent or if you are a trader, what would motivate you to want to carry out trade with a place like South Vietnam, right? The assumption that people have, I still hear today, is that in a country that's torn apart by war and civil conflict and unrest, it's probably not the best place to do any business, right? You have no idea whether or not it will end, and if it ends, whether or not all the money and time and investment that you had, placed in that, you had given to that place would be lost because the side that promoted trade with you lost the conflict. So I was looking at questions of motivation. I was also looking at questions of commodities. What kind of commodities would traders trade between South Vietnam and Singapore? And what kind of problems would emerge in the import and export of these commodities? And finally, the third point is, if you look at the experiences of the two governments as well as the traders from both countries, what does that tell us about doing business in South Vietnam during the Cold War? So here I'll be looking at things like successes, and there were success stories as well as failures. So what could possibly have been the reasons for their failures, and if they did succeed, what happened?
Can I ask a very quick question?
Yes.
I see the first and the third questions very much interrelated. How would you address that?
Can I come to that after
Yeah, sure.
the question? Right, so the first thing is motivation. So now we look at really Singapore and Vietnam, they're going through this period of the Cold War. How would governments in Saigon and Singapore be actually motivated to trade with each other? They were both anti-communist regimes, and they both had communist rivals. So in Singapore, it's the Malayan Communist Party. In South Vietnam, of course, it's communist rivals from the north. And there's this quote that the then president of South Vietnam gave or said that about seeking neighborly collaboration. The Prime Minister of Singapore at that time was Lee Kuan Yew, and he also talked about the need for trading and other ties with other countries in Southeast Asia in order to perhaps strengthen this sort of anti-communist movement around the region. So there were other papers around, I noticed, that talked about CETO and all, so it's more or less along the same line. From the point of Singapore traders, was there potential conflict, or potential profit, sorry. Some of the traders were, obviously they conducted trade because of the need, because of the possibility of making profit, right? It's money. The reason why they're involved in business is because they want to make money. It sounds rather crude, but quite a number of them unabashedly will tell you that, yeah, the reason why I'm in business is because I want to make money. And there were business opportunities. What kind of business opportunities could come with wartime? Now, some of these Singaporean traders were part of these old Chinese business networks that I mentioned earlier on. So they were essentially just carried on from where the families had left off. So in the old, before World War II, for instance, it is possible that a family business could stretch from, say, China, southern China to Southeast Asia. So maybe a family member in Xiamen, another family member in Saigon, another family member in Singapore. So these networks would be made use of even during the time of the Vietnam War. Now, potential problems. Again, this is from what I could see looking at some of the materials. Now, the materials I used essentially for, I've seen so far, are really oral history recordings that were held in the National Archives of Singapore, as well as some newspaper reports and government official reports that were released during that time in Singapore. And when we look at all these reports, they do tell us something about problems that traders faced during this period of time, not so much governments, but if you are a Singaporean trader at that time or businessman and you want to do business in South Vietnam, there could be problems. Some problems were really political issues within South Vietnam itself, like the first point on there, when the then president of South Vietnam decided that all ethnic Chinese in South Vietnam must adopt Vietnamese nationality. So they all had to adopt Vietnamese names, for instance. And that actually affected some of the Chinese business networks that had been around for 100 years, because all those businesses that were in existence in Saigon during this period had to be Vietnamized, if I can use that word. And if you insist on keeping your Chinese name, you will lose your business, because the second decree over there, number 53, actually said that if you're ethnic Chinese, you cannot conduct 11 different kinds of businesses, so including things like fishmongering, butchery, rice milling, and what else? There were 11 different kind of businesses that you could not take part in. So that is effectively ruined some of those old business networks, and there were protests not only in Singapore about these decrees, but in the case of, for instance, Taiwan or the Republic of China, which was an ally with South Vietnam during the Cold War, they also tried to arrange for ethnic Chinese in Vietnam to be repatriated to Taiwan for political reasons. Now, some of the other problems, of course, would be the war itself. So after the Tet Offensive of 1968, when there was a major nationwide attack by the Vietnamese communists against the Army of South Vietnam and the American forces, there were already predictions after that incident that Saigon would fall one day. As early as 1970, you begin to see reports about what's going to happen if Saigon fell, how is that going to affect things like trade and military alliances and so on and so forth. But yet trade continued as normal until 1975, right? And the trade was actually centered around Saigon, Cholon, which is actually, Cholon is actually the Chinatown of Saigon itself. So and there's a reason why that area was chosen. If you look at Singapore Chinese merchants, right? Those who went to trade in Saigon were Cantonese speaking because the Chinese in Saigon spoke Cantonese, while those who went to trade in Cholon were Teochew speaking, which is a Chinese dialect, because the Chinese residents in Cholon spoke Teochew. So obviously there's linguistic similarities and it's easier to do trade that way. So what kind of things were traded? It's listed down there. So exports to Saigon. There was this thing about petroleum products. So basically anything to do with petrol, oil, machinery and so on would be exported to American forces based in South Vietnam from Singapore, along with things like honey, sugar and canned meat. Imports from Saigon include coffee, tea, fish, crude rubber and so on. Now the thing is that if you look at this export-import trade, it reflected more the way Singapore's economy was changing at the time. In the late 50s and early 1960s, Singapore still depended very heavily on what's called the entrepot trade. So basically materials coming in from, say, Jakarta or Kuala Lumpur would come to Singapore and then it's processed and re-exported again, so perhaps to Saigon. Same thing, materials coming from Saigon could be repackaged or processed and then exported again to somewhere else. So at in the early stages, the entrepot trade was important for Singapore, so these imports and exports were crucial. There was also problems when it comes to smuggling and the black market. Now it's not surprising since Vietnam was in a state of war at the time. Smuggling, there are some, I actually heard 2 or 3 oral history interviews in the National Archives where, for instance, there was one interview with a guy named Xia Chiang Mi, who was a journalist with Reuters at the time. And he commented that every time when he boarded a plane from Singapore to Saigon, he would find himself seated next to other businessmen. And some of them were basically smugglers. Right? They came into Singapore and they tried to buy, for instance, shirts, this kind of shirts or those fountain pens or anything like that. And they buy in bulk and then they try to sell it in Saigon. And sometimes they would try to bring across the border goods from maybe Cambodia or somewhere just to avoid declaring at customs. And the interviewer actually asked this Mr. Xia, wouldn't it be odd if you were to land at the airport and customs open your bag and see 300 shirts? And Mr. Xia just simply said, well, at the most you just say that you just want to bring shirts. It's not against the law to bring shirts into South Vietnam anyway. So, but then those shirts could be sold at the black market for quite a hefty profit. The thing about the black market also is that some of the goods that were traded from Singapore into Saigon ended up over there. So whoever was trying to sell the products at the black market would actually make a profit. Now sometimes the black market was also things like currency speculation. So for instance, there was another interviewee who mentioned that when he was there in Vietnam in 1955 or 56, $1 could be changed for 11 piastre, which is the South Vietnamese currency, officially changed to 11 piastre. But if you go to the black market, it's 45. So you could get almost 4 times the amount if you actually changed it. So this interviewee actually said that when he was staying at this hotel, the hotel manager told him that, okay, you are staying at $10 a night, still a big money at the time. So $10 would basically mean 110 piastre, right? So the manager actually told him, why don't you just simply take your $10, go out to the black market, change to 450 piastre and give me 220. So the hotel will keep 110, the manager will keep 110, this interviewee will have 230 piastre left, he could then change back to US dollar again. So everybody wins. It's one of those things that was going on at that time. And the last point I mentioned also earlier on, that trade was mainly centered in Saigon and Cholon. And the reason why is because with the war going on, it was very difficult to do business in the provinces. So many of those official reports and newspapers, when they talk about the South Vietnam trade, they were almost exclusively focused on Saigon and Cholon. So we think of business opportunities. Now there were some good opportunities for some businessmen, and the names you see here are actually interviewees at the National Archives of Singapore itself. Bay Lian Peck, the first name down there, he was quite enterprising. He actually went out of his way to find out what do American forces want from me if I were to trade in Vietnam. And he actually founded a company that will provide US forces with anything they ask for. He had a staff of about 200 that will work sometimes 24 hours just to get whatever it is that the Americans want. So the Americans, for instance, will give him an order saying we want X number of cans of fish or X number of condoms or something like he actually mentioned it. And he would actually bring the order from the American forces to the Bank of America in Singapore. The Bank of America will pay him, and he will arrange for all these goods to be sent to Vietnam once a week. So once a week there will be a plane that will take off from Singapore airport to Don Sanak airport in Saigon itself. So for him then, wartime was really a good business opportunity. So here are American forces, I can give them what they want. Now similarly, Neo Kiat Siong, he did almost the same thing, but he did it on a smaller scale. He basically arranged for things like medicated oil, radios, batteries, seafood, dried shrimp, anything, to be sent to Saigon to either be sold to American forces in Vietnam itself or to local Vietnamese people. But he's not that wealthy, so he didn't really arrange for a plane. He traveled by boat with his family. So family of 5 would get into a boat, 5 days to reach Saigon, do whatever and do there for a week, and then 5 days back by boat to Singapore. Chin Ka Chong is actually was a journalist. So he was based in Saigon during the time of the Vietnam War, and he made a comment that the Vietnam War, it was a good time to make money, and he gave the example of how tailors in Singapore actually went to Saigon. So what the tailors would do is they go to Saigon, they open a shop, anybody walk in, including American servicemen, they do the measurements for the shirt or the trousers, and then the tailors will fly back to Singapore, make the clothes, and then bring back to Saigon to sell to whoever it is who ordered those clothes. So in a way, it was a good time to make business. Now there was some optimism against for trade between Singapore and Vietnam, but at the same time, the Singapore government itself had very sort of a negative view of the real impact of the kind of trade with South Vietnam. So just as an example over here, these are actually from newspaper articles at that time. The one on the left, where the South Vietnamese government wants to order or buy 10,000 tons of refined sugar from Singapore, worth $4.75 million, and in 1968, 4.75 million Singapore dollars is a huge sum of money. And in 1969 March, you have a South Vietnamese parliamentary group that came to Singapore on a goodwill mission. Again, is to find out whether or not there's any possibility of further trade between the two countries. Now, if you look at articles like this, I get a sense or the impression that the ones who really felt that there was any sort of potential for trade between Singapore and South Vietnam are actually from the South Vietnamese themselves. Right? Perhaps there was a reason why I have to find out. The need to continually trade with Singapore and to see potential in that trade with Singapore. In the case of Singapore itself, initially there was some thought that perhaps if the businessmen were to go to Vietnam and make money, tons of money, maybe the Singapore government could do the same thing. So Intraco was actually started in November 1968. Intraco stands for International Trading Company. It is a Singapore government-owned trading corporation. And if you look at an article down there in 1969, the first overseas office established by Intraco was in Saigon. So not Tokyo or any of the other major trading centers around the world at that time. They decided to go to Saigon. But then I was quite surprised when I look at, for instance, from the Singapore government perspective, at least in 1969, obviously Saigon meant something. That's why the first overseas office had to be established down there. But then in this document, which is a report that was written in 1970 by the Economic Development Board, if you look at some of the lines here, it said that, you know, the trade with South Vietnam, when they use Vietnam here, they refer to South Vietnam. It is estimated that this contributed less than 2% to Singapore's annual GDP. So it's a really, really small thing. So the question for me then is, you know, if the trade was really, really that small, it's just only 2%, of which petroleum exports constituted the biggest form of exports, why was there a need for Intraco to actually try to set up an international, the first office in Saigon? Why would Singapore want to continually give the impression that, you know, trade with South Vietnam was important when this was supposedly the reality at the time? So just coming to an end, just towards 1975, in 1971, the Singapore Chinese Chamber of Commerce and Industry actually planned to go on a business trip to Saigon in 1973. Now the trip did not happen because by 1971, Malaysia recognized Hanoi, North Vietnam. So the reports in the newspaper said that, you know, the Chinese Chamber of Commerce will not go to Saigon, and in an interview with some of the merchants in archives in Singapore, one of them actually said that the reason why we decided not to go to Saigon was because we didn't want the Singapore government to quarrel with the Malaysian government. So the Malaysian government recognized Hanoi, then you, Singapore merchant, go to Saigon. It's like, what's going on here? So the trip did not happen. But then, even at that time, from 1971 and 1975, there was no sign that the war would end. So business just went on as usual until 30th of April 1975, when Saigon fell to the North Vietnamese. That's when you find stories of the loss of investment or factories by Singapore entrepreneurs. So I'll come to this guy's, Lau Hong Yin's example later on. Just to give an example of the situation at that time, in 1972, the Straits Times actually reported this American tourist who went to South Vietnam, and he said, you know, reading the newspapers, I thought the whole of South Vietnam was in flames. It's quieter here than the Democratic Convention Hall. So it's, you look at it, it meant that really life went on as usual, nothing was happening. On 2nd August 1973, Singapore actually decided to do the sit on the fence kind of thing. We decided to establish ties with both sides. So, in a way, the only reason given down there as to why Singapore set up ties with Saigon officially was because of trade. And Hanoi, again, is probably because they didn't want North Vietnam to be too angry with what Singapore had just done. So, earlier on I mentioned about this guy, Lau Hong Yin, who lost his factories. His family had actually invested about $300,000 to $400,000 in 3 factories to produce fish meal. So fish meal is the product that you process in order to feed animals. And out of that you get fish oil as well, so you can sell as fish oil pills and so on. So once 1975 came, he didn't realize what was going on. He went back to Singapore in early April 1975. Then 3 weeks later, Saigon fell. So he and his family lost everything. And his family actually owned, the 3 factories were actually run by a company in Saigon itself, and Lau Hong Yin's family actually owned 51% of the company. So really, they lost everything. So just as looking at the conclusion itself, you know, the idea of, you know, do we really need peaceful conditions as a prerequisite for trade? If that's the case, then really with the Vietnam War going on at that time, trade just continued on as usual. Earlier on I mentioned about how the trade was actually a very small proportion of Singapore's overall export trade. So was it more a question of just keeping up appearances during the Vietnam War that, you know, Singapore and South Vietnam were allies and therefore they need to face the Americans, and they need to face the communist enemy together? The idea of profit and opportunity as motivation for the traders who actually left Singapore and went off to Saigon to start companies or factories, and the resilience of some of these trade and business networks. They were only resilient because at that point of time there was no idea of, no inkling that South Vietnam would eventually fall, and obviously when the end came, they lost everything. So this is just a final slide, and there's some further work I thought of I should do. So obviously a further exploration of the trade networks, including looking at other sources, especially from South Vietnam's perspective, as well as especially a study of business conditions in Saigon. I only know about business conditions in Singapore, but I have to find out exactly what was going on in Saigon at the time. So yeah, that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason.
Yeah, your question earlier.
No, actually, the reason why I asked that because I saw your outlines and I want to know what are you going to talk, because the first question and the third are the same. But I do have two questions
Okay.
about traded goods, but you did answer one towards the end, so I have only one left. So you know what I'm gonna ask. So basically, you were talking about petroleum goods, right? And you were talking about that's mainly for the U.S. So I haven't seen much about the U.S. policy in this context. So when you talk about trades, I'm really cautious about trading items for export and imports. And if that's linked to the U.S., then that is very important. That's what I feel.
Yeah, there is maybe because of the time, I didn't really want to say too much. But if you look here, yeah, petroleum products, petroleum exports to South Vietnam quadrupled. So now it constituted 42% of total petroleum exports from Singapore. Now, basically what the report is saying is that if not for petroleum exports, we really have nothing to do with South Vietnam.